What's going on there, YouTube? The Hodgepodge here. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a little bit of a different video. I am in Car Mechanic Simulator 2015, and some of my partners in DOJ were inquiring about how engines work. Some of them were playing Car Mechanic Simulator and they said that they didn't even really understand how cars work. They just enjoyed playing the game. So I figured I would do a little explanation video, maybe educate some people out there on how cars work. Now, I am by no means a professional car mechanic. I do not know everything about cars. I don't know all of the minute details. Um, I do have some knowledge on how they work. Just I guess you could say like a basic understanding on how they work. So I'm going to relay my knowledge onto you guys, so that way you can be more informed, and eventually you can rub it in some people's faces that you know things. So I have two cars here. I have the Royale Crown, I believe this one is. And this is an inline 4 cylinder. And by cylinders, I'm talking about the holes here. These are the cylinders. And it's an inline 4 because the cylinders are in a line. That makes sense, right? I4, inline 4. Okay, and then over here I have the Royale GTR, and the Royale GTR has a V8 engine in it. That means there's 8 cylinders and they're arranged in a V shape, and I will show you that here in a second. But here we have 4 cylinders on this side, 4 cylinders on this side, making for a total of 8. And the reason why it is called a V8 is because the cylinders... I gotta raise the car up to show you. The reason why it is called a V8 is because the cylinders are drilled in the pistons here, which are these things here. The piston is this round thing up here, and this is the conrod here, or some people just call them rods. But they are arranged, as you can see, in a V pattern. V pattern. So that is where the terminology V8 comes from. They also have a V6, which is arranged in a very similar way. However, it is just like the front 2 cylinders would be gone, so you would just have 3 on each side. And then an even more rare variant is a V4, which, as it would suggest, there's only 4 cylinders, and they would also be arranged in a V. So it would be basically half of what this is. Okay, so the way that these engines work, and as I reassemble the engine, I will explain things on what they do and their purpose in making your car go fast. So we have cylinders here, and in each of these cylinders we have a piston, which is this round thing here, and the piston is connected to a rod, which is connected to the crankshaft. We'll raise the car up again and I'll show you the crankshaft. Oop, too far. Okay, this thing here, this right here, starting basically right here, it runs all the way through the bottom of the engine, and then it comes out here on the back side. That's called the crankshaft. Okay, the crankshaft is essentially the core of the engine. It is what gives power to your wheels to propel your car forward or backward. The pistons here are connected to said crankshaft. And you might notice here that the crankshaft, if you follow the yellow outline, it's not just a straight rod. It's, as I'm gesturing at my computer monitor here, like I'm trying to explain it to you like an idiot. But it is, you notice how it kind of changes its shape, and that is extremely important, because that is how it gets its rotation, is the way it's shaped and where the pistons connect. And I'll explain to you why that is. So as you can see here, like, you have a piston connected right here to this part of the crankshaft. And if we go up to the top side of the engine, you'll see that this piston is probably relatively close to the top. So we'll go back up here. Okay, and as you can see, this third piston here is almost right at the top of the cylinder. Okay, so how this works is you have the piston here at the top of the cylinder, and then you have an engine head that comes up here. And now an engine needs three things to function. It needs fuel, it needs air, and it needs a spark to ignite the fuel. So like with any, if you have a campfire, you notice when you blow into the campfire, the coals get hotter. Or if you have coals or charcoal or whatever, you blow into it and they get hotter. It's because air is necessary fuel for flames, and the fuel, as everybody knows, common knowledge, is a highly combustible liquid and vapor. So you mix those two together within the engine head, and I will throw an engine head on one side just to show you. Now I can't really show you the inside of the engine head, but there's inside of the engine head, basically right in here where this would be, there's a little chamber that would sit right above where the piston is, and there's a little chamber there, and that's called the compression chamber. So what happens is, think of the cylinder as like the tube of a syringe. Okay, everybody's gone to get shots before, a flu shot maybe. Everybody knows how a syringe functions. You have the cylinder of the syringe, and you have a plunger that pushes the fluid out the end of the syringe. This is kind of a similar concept to the syringe. You have your cylinder here, and then the piston is essentially like a plunger. So if you were to fill the cylinder with liquid and then push the piston up, it would push the liquid out the end. But instead, what the engine does is it mixes fuel and air, and then the piston will come up and compress the air and the fuel in the compression chamber, and then the spark plugs will spark, which ignites the fuel and creates an explosion. And the explosion, as everybody commonly understands, it expands air rapidly, hence why you get shock waves, and hence why you always see people in the movies flying through the air after there's an explosion. It expands the air rapidly, and the explosion will thrust the piston downward. So you have like a piston down here that's kind of in the lower section. So the explosion will thrust this piston downward. And then what happens is, when this piston gets thrown downwards, raise the car back up again, show you. When this piston gets thrown downwards, it's connected to this rod, which is connected to the crankshaft. So when it gets thrown downwards, it comes down this way. What it does is it pushes the crankshaft around Essentially, it'll go, this is our piston here that we're talking about. It'll come down, and then the crankshaft itself will come around like this, because of the force of that explosion throws the piston down. The piston's connected to the rod, which is connected to the crankshaft, which is connected to the hip bone. That's a joke. But it'll basically force the crankshaft around. So that is why the crankshaft is designed in this way, is so when the cylinders are firing, which is the terminology for when the explosion happens, when the cylinders are firing, it is set up to do so that when each piston is at the top, it'll fire and then throw the piston down, and then each piston is connected to its representative place on the crankshaft, and so it'll fire when each piston is at the top, which means that's where the crankshaft portion of the crankshaft that piston is connected to is at the top, and then when it fires, it pushes the piston around, the crankshaft around. Okay, does that make any sense? I hope it makes some sort of sense. So essentially, the pistons and the explosions spin your crankshaft, and your crankshaft spins, and your crankshaft is always spinning when your engine is on, because your cylinders are always firing. It's always spinning, and when you give it more fuel, it spins faster. And I'll throw the transmission on this car here after a while, and I'll explain to you what happens when this rotates and how that power gets transferred from the crankshaft here to your rear wheels. But now for more on the engine. Okay, so we already established the piston here. It's like a syringe, like a plunger on a syringe. Pressure builds up, the fuel and air ignites, and it blows the piston downwards to rotate the crankshaft. So how you get air into the engine and fuel into the engine and the spark to create that explosion is, here we have an engine head. Now the engine head, let me throw a spark plug in here too. Oh, I don't want that one. How about these performance ones? Okay, so we have the engine head. Now we have these things here, these little spring-like things. These are known as... Oh, okay. Nifty. You can see in there. Okay, so these are known as valve covers, I guess, or valve springs. That's what they're called. They're called valve springs. Okay, so there's these little plates on the top and the little springs here, and we have what is known as a crankshaft. Okay, now the crankshaft, you notice how it's got these little teardrop shaped little outcroppings on them. I don't know the specific terminology for them. So while your engine is on and the crankshaft is turning, the crankshaft on the front side, there'll be a whole bunch of belts. They are connected to the the crankshaft is connected to the camshaft via the belts, so it causes the camshaft to spin. And the camshaft is designed in a way to, in sequence with the pistons, it allows air into the compression chamber. So, like if you notice here, there's a little bit of a gap. I guess that's the engine head there, but so these are the valve springs. The crankshaft, or the camshaft, rotates, and it pushes down on the spring. Okay, when it pushes down on the spring, there's a little rod in there. Let's see if I can see it and show it to you. I don't know if it'll show it to me. Okay, it won't really show it to me, but there's a rod that's in there, and when it pushes down on the spring, it pushes down on that rod. And what the rod does is it goes down, and these here are called the valves. These little black circles here. These are called the valves. And what the rod will do is it'll push open the valve, and it will allow air into the engine. Now the air comes in through this opening here. Okay, so there's the air comes in through these openings here. So there's one for each cylinder on this engine. The air comes in, and the valves open up, and it allows air into right here where the piston is. So there's the piston, and then there's the valves here. So those open up and they allow air into the engine, or into the cylinder. And then you have your spark plug up here. Okay, now your spark plug, the whole purpose of your spark plug is to ignite the air fuel mixture. So your spark plug right here will spark, and it goes down. As you can tell, spark plug goes down a little ways in there. It goes down to about right in here. And so the air gets allowed in, and then the fuel gets let in with the fuel rail. I cannot put that in yet because I don't have the engine assembled enough yet, but I will show you how that, or where that goes. And so the camshaft will open up the valves to allow air into the cylinder, and the fuel will go into the cylinder. The spark plug will ignite it, which causes the explosion, which again pushes the piston downward and rotates the crankshaft. Okay, it's a pretty simple yet also complex idea. And I don't really know if there's really, like I said, I'm not like super 100% knowledgeable on cars, but that is a general idea of how this V8 engine would work. Now I'm going to spend some time and assemble this engine a little further, just so you can see more or less what it looks like when it's closer to assembled here. So we're going to throw some parts on it. Okay, now here is the timing belt, and pretty much everybody's heard about the timing belt. Timing gears, timing. It is everything when it comes to engines. If your engine is out of time in any aspect, then your engine is not going to run well, if it even runs at all. So, and for the reasons that I explained, that is why timing is so important. If your timing belt breaks, it throws everything out of time. Your engine's not going to run. If you try and assemble an engine yourself and you don't set everything exactly the way it should be, your engine's not going to run, or it's going to run really, really bad. Again, because it's all on the timing. If one of these pistons that's under here was towards the bottom, and then the explosion happened, you're not going to get that rotation in your crankshaft that you should, because it's not, A, there's not enough pressure in there, and B, there's not enough distance for that explosion to thrust your piston down and give it that rotation. So that is why timing is so important. Your explosion has to happen at just the right time for your piston to come up and then get thrusted back down, and to do that over and over and over again. The timing has got to be perfect on it. Okay, let's throw on the intake manifold here. And then here we have what's known as a fuel rail. Okay, the fuel rail is basically your fuel injector, and it is what injects fuel in with your air mixture to generate that explosion. So your fuel rail here, it sits up here. On this engine, it sits up here. It's a different location for all kinds of different engines. But your fuel rail will inject the fuel down into, essentially it's like right down into here, and then the air and fuel mixture comes down, and then the valves open up and it goes into where the piston is, the air and fuel mixture, and then the spark plug ignites it, creates your explosion. Now how you get air into the engine is, it varies. Some cars are turbocharged, some cars are supercharged. So that all depends on the car, essentially, and they do different things. Turbochargers and superchargers, essentially, they suck in more air. Turbochargers, they suck in air and they pressurize it, so the air has a higher density, and therefore it creates a larger explosion and gives you more power. Superchargers are similar to that. Most cars are naturally aspirated, which means that they just have, like, this car here, it just has like a regular air filter, and you can't see it in the game, but there'd be an air filter which would go right here. Okay, and you'd have an intake hose, which would be like right here. This would take the air in, and then it would get filtered. And then you'd have an outlet hose, which is up here, and this hose would essentially run back here to where the throttle is. The throttle determines how much air you let into the engine, and that is also in time with the fuel. It'll determine how much fuel gets put into the engine as well. So that determines the frequency of the explosions and the intensity of the explosions within the engine, which in turn determines how fast the crankshaft rotates, which in turn determines how fast your wheels will rotate. Okay, so with the basics covered, I'm going to finish assembling the engine, and then there'll be a couple of things that I will talk to you about at that point. Okay, so here we are with our mostly assembled V8 engine. One thing I forgot to mention earlier regarding the valves, remember the little spring-like things, and then there was the camshafts, which had the teardrop knobs on them that would rotate and they would push the spring downward. The other purpose of those is not only do they let air into the compression chamber, but they also let the exhaust leave the compression chamber. So it'll open up one side to let the air in, and then it'll open up the other side to let the exhaust out, which is the spent fuel and whatever other gases remain in the compression chamber. It lets them out, so then it can let more fresh air into the compression chamber, so that they would go essentially like there's 4 valves for each cylinder. So there's 2 to let air in, and then 2 to let the exhaust out. And again, it's all on that timing. Your timing has to be correct. Your intake cams and your exhaust cams, they have to be working in time so that everything functions as it should. There's also another thing that's extremely important is all these moving parts everything rubbing together. Like these camshafts here, they're constantly rubbing on to the tops of these valve springs. They have to be well lubricated to prevent wear and tear. So that is why oil is extremely important for your engine. Make sure you are changing your oil at your user manual's recommended intervals, because you can cause a lot of damage by not doing so. Okay, these things get really hot, and if they wear out over time, you're looking at expensive repairs to take the engine apart and replace these components so that your engine will work properly again. Same thing goes for your pistons. Your pistons are always rubbing on the insides of these cylinders here, so they have to be well lubricated to avoid any damage. Oh, that's a pretty good look at the valves here. Interesting. Okay. So now to tie this all together, I'm going to assemble the transmission and the drive line, and I'll explain to you how those work. Okay, so as far as the transmissions go, we have what's called the flywheel. The flywheel connects directly to the crankshaft. As you can see, there was a crankshaft. This is the crankshaft right here. This is part of the crankshaft. The flywheel connects directly to it. Okay. So, and then on the other end, you have the crankshaft pulley here, which spins these belts, which run your alternator. Your alternator charges up your battery. Also runs your power steering pump, so you can have power steering. This car does not have an AC compressor, which a belt would run that as well, and it also pumps your coolant through your engine system to help keep everything cool. So the crankshaft not only does the pistons, but it also runs these belts, and it also spins this flywheel here. Now your flywheel is connected directly to the crankshaft. Your crankshaft is always spinning when your engine is on, so your flywheel is always spinning when your engine is on. As far as manual transmissions go, they have what's called a clutch. Okay, what the clutch does, I'll install the clutch plate here. But what the clutch does is basically it separates the transmission from the crankshaft. So the crankshaft, or the separates the transmission from the flywheel, which is connected to the crankshaft, so that the flywheel can spin freely without trying to spin the transmission. Because if your car is stopped and you're trying to spin the transmission, it's not going to work, because the gears are not going to be able to spin because your wheels are stopped, and they're being prevented from doing so by your brakes. So that's why people stall out and they kill their engine. So the clutch creates a very small gap between the transmission and the flywheel. So when you push in the clutch pedal in a manual transmission car, it pulls the clutch away just so slightly. It just pulls it away very slightly, and permits the flywheel to rotate freely without trying to rotate the transmission. When you release the clutch, it comes back down, and it will start to rub up against the flywheel, and then once the clutch is released enough, it will basically the flywheel will grab a hold of it and start to rotate the clutch, which then rotates the transmission. pressure plate here that holds everything in place, and then the release bearing, which is what helps pull the clutch away from the flywheel ever so slightly. So this is basically the whole clutch assembly. And just to recap, flywheel always spins, the clutch is separated from the flywheel to stop it from spinning so that you can be stationary and the engine can continue to spin and not try to spin your transmission. Now we'll put the gearbox, aka transmission, we'll mount that on here. And we'll mount the starter on here too. Okay, so we have our transmission here. Transmissions are really, they're kind of complex, and it's not really easy. That doesn't line up at all. They missed the mark on that one. But anyway, this part right here comes out of the gearbox. This is one of the shafts that operates within the transmission. Now, if this would have been done properly, this shaft would go within the clutch release bearing, and it would attach itself to the clutch itself. However, they did not line it up properly. So this is the clutch plate right here, the clutch. This right here is the shaft that goes into the transmission. It should be down here. So when the clutch grabs hold of the flywheel, or the flywheel grabs hold of the clutch and it starts to spin everything, it starts to spin this shaft here and gets everything spinning within the transmission. I did find a really good video. I may link to it in the description, where a guy actually has a disassembled transmission and he explains very well how they operate and how they work. They just simply don't have that level of detail in this game for me to explain it to you using Car Mechanic Simulator as a reference. Just put it in simple terms, there's a shaft here that runs into the transmission. Essentially, there's a shaft that runs into the transmission here, and then there's another lower shaft here that is connected to this one via gears, and then there's another shaft here that's connected with more gears, and then another shaft, and then it comes out here, and it eventually ends up over here. So there's like multiple shafts in the transmission, and they're all connected by gears of varying sizes, and that determines how fast your drive line is going to rotate based on which gear you're in. And yeah, it's hard to go into much more detail than that in Car Mechanic Simulator. So anyway, the shafts in the transmission are connected to the crankshaft in the engine. So the crankshaft spins because of the explosions we talked about, creates that rotation. The rotation gets transferred to the transmission, so then the shafts in the transmission rotate, and then those shafts in turn, come on, let's get to it. Those shafts in turn connect to the drive shaft here that I'm installing. If you've ever seen a large delivery truck, like if you've driven next to a large delivery truck, you've seen something similar to this that comes out and it rotates. So the transmission will rotate this drive shaft here, and the drive shaft connects to, on rear-wheel drive cars, it connects here to the rear suspension components. So it connects right here to this, and so the drive shaft will rotate, and that in turn is connected to a shaft in here which has yet more gears similar to the transmission, and it will rotate those gears, and it is those gears are connected to the axles. Like, for instance, right here, there's a rear drive axle. So the rear drive axles on this particular vehicle, they are connected here, and there's gearing in there that they're connected to. And when this rotates the gears, it rotates the drive shafts. And then the drive axles are connected to the wheels, so that thus they rotate the wheels and give you your forward momentum. It's a lot of basic, I guess, physics all rolled into one. You have your levers, and you have springs, and you have rotation, and gearing system. Lots of gears, lots of shafts, and they all work simultaneously as one unit to give you your forward momentum. So, I mean, that's really it. I can't think of a whole lot more that I could explain as far as how engines work. They're amazing pieces of technology. I mean, just to say that now, I mean, it's just mind-boggling the amount of time and energy that it took for somebody to come up with something so intricate and complex, yet also using simple ideas such as rods and levers, and it's just mind-boggling. But yeah, that's how your standard V8 engine works. There's also an oil pan that goes on the bottom side of the engine that hides the crankshaft and the pistons from view, and it holds your oil. And then there's also a pump that pumps oil up into the upper portions of your engine and into the areas of your engine that need it, like the cylinders and whatnot, to keep everything lubricated and from getting damaged. Yeah, that's really it for the V8 engine. Now here we have an inline 4, and it is this a very similar concept. The difference is, of course, how the engine is arranged. And this is a front-wheel drive car, so there's no shaft that goes to the back. Your transmission is right here on the side of the car. It is, but it works in the same way with in a manual transmission with the clutch and all that stuff. It works in the same way. It's just that the power and everything gets transferred to this backside here, and then there's basically there's gears in here, and then it rotates the shaft, which rotates the axles, which rotates the wheels. It's the same concept. It's just mounted sideways, and it's a little bit different as far as because it's got to drive the front wheels, so everything has to be right up here on the front. So it's a slightly different design, but it's a very similar concept. Same goes for the engine. The only difference is that these are not in a V, it's just a straight line, and as such, let me get out of the car here. The crankshaft has to be slightly different. It's for the most part the same, but it's slightly different. It's not as wide. That is all kinds of messed up. It should not be coming that close to the edge of the engine block there. But whatever, it's a video game. It's not really much that we can do about it. But yeah, it works in the exact same way. The fuel gets mixed up here at the top with air, and then the spark ignites it, throws the piston down, rotates the crankshaft, etc., etc. Again, same thing up here. You have your camshafts. Well, you know, one of the performance ones. Let me buy another performance one. I need camshaft. Okay. Okay, as you can see, same concept here. Got your camshafts. They push down on the valve springs. God, though, why is everything so like misaligned? That annoys me. But yeah, they push down on the valves. The valve springs. The valve springs open up the valves here. They let the exhausts in. They let the air in. They let the exhaust out. So this here is where the air comes in. This intake manifold here. So there's the throttle here that determines how much air gets drawn into the engine, which determines the size of the explosions. Excuse me. And then the exhaust comes out on this side of this particular engine, on the front side. Most of the time on these kinds of engines, it will come out on the back side of the engine. But on this particular model of engine, it comes out on the front. Excuse me for yawning. Now this engine here is turbocharged. Turbochargers are freaking cool. I have one in my Audi, and that not only sounds cool, but it gives you power. So I will explain how turbochargers work. Okay, so essentially turbochargers use exhaust gases. So this is the exhaust here. The exhaust comes out of the engine this direction. Okay, and it comes down this tube, and it comes in here into the one end of your turbocharger. Now there's a spool in here that's kind of like this one with the little fans, and the exhaust gases will come out and it'll spin that fan, and before the exhausts get released down into the exhaust pipe here. And when the exhaust gases spin that side, it's connected to this side, and this side spins and it draws air in. And so there would be tubing and stuff connected from, like, this is the intake here and the outtake, and then there would be, this is kind of messed up, at the air filter. The air filter should be on this side of the car to save room and whatnot, but essentially there would be tubing that runs from here and it comes around and connects to this. So then the air would come through the air filter, go through the tubing, and come in here. And what the turbocharger does is it pressurizes the air, builds up pressure. And so that makes the air more dense. And then the air comes out of here, and there isn't one on this car here, but it will go through what's called an intercooler, which is very similar to a radiator. The air will run through the intercooler, and the intercooler cools off the air a little bit because cooler air is more dense and ignites better. So it'll run through the intercooler, which would be Usually it's mounted right on the front side of the radiator, or it's right underneath the radiator. So it would run through the intercooler, and then it would run back up here to where the throttle is. So there would be another tubing, and that's why I think the air filter over here is stupid, because you'd have to run a pipe around over here, or you'd have to run one all the way around the engine, and then you have to run more piping through here, and then all the way back up to your intake. So then there would be another tube that runs up to your intake. The throttle opens up this valve here and sucks the air into the engine. With the turbo, the air is pressurized, so it's more dense and explodes better. And then that said air comes out of the exhaust and into this section of the turbocharger, and it just continuously repeats. So, yeah, that's it. It's really all the information I've got as far as how engines go, how engines work. If you have any questions regarding that, feel free to leave a comment, and if I don't know the answer offhand, I can definitely look it up for you and provide you an answer. Hopefully this video is informative for you and taught you a couple things about engines. If there's any information that I've said that's not entirely correct, like I said, I'm not a mechanic. I'm not super knowledgeable in engines. I don't ever claim to be a car guru. I just have a basic understanding of the engines and how they work. But if there's anything that I mentioned that is not correct, please let me know so I can update any corrections in my video. My goal here is not to be a know-it-all. It's just to pass on the knowledge that I have onto others, and if any of my information is wrong, I do not want to give the wrong information to anybody. So with that said, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. Don't hesitate to subscribe. Subscribers is what builds channels and helps channels thrive. So please, if you enjoyed my content, please hit that subscribe button. And until next time, I will see you guys all later. Have a good one.